probably the best thing is to kind of pick up where we left off with the history of Susanna, or Susanna. We're looking at the additions to Daniel's book. We've covered the first one, the prayer of Azariah and the song of the three holy children, which is stuck into chapter 3, and now we're looking at the histories of Susanna and Bel and the dragon, or Bel and the snake, maybe as your Bible says, some type of creature or monster. The last two, Susanna and Bel and the dragon, are attached in Bibles today to the end of the book of Daniel, making up chapters 13 and 14. Chapters 13 and 14. We have 12. Daniel chapter 11 is a long chapter. Daniel chapter 12 is relatively short. And then chapter 13 in the Catholic Bible would be the history of Susanna. What characterizes both of these latter editions, Susanna and Bel and the dragon, what characterizes them together is the nature of the writing. They're mystery stories, or detective stories, they're riddles or puzzles. You're kept right on the edge of your seat, going from episode to episode. You can tell it's a play between good and evil, between vice and virtue. And you can guess ahead of time, like you can with today's Hollywood movies, that the good is going to win, but you can't exactly see how. And so you're kept on the edge of your seat waiting for the final deliverance of the good individual. Or if it's just a principle. In Bel and the Dragon, although Daniel is delivered several times, it's really the principle of monotheism versus polytheism and idolatry that triumphs in the end of the book. We've said that the best way to look at the history of Susanna is to take it verse by verse, divide it up according to an outline, fashion, or form. And so the first 4 verses introduce us to Susanna, whose beauty matches her piety. She's a pious wife of rich Joachim, someone who's now living in Babylonian captivity. So the alleged context of the story of Daniel and Susanna, or the history of Susanna, would chronologically fit. I'm saying the alleged story would because Daniel is a captive in Babylon as well, so he could well have met 2 people named Joachim and Susanna. So we're simply introduced to Susanna, who is the chief character of the story. Daniel doesn't come until the second, or till the third of the book. You've got 2/3 dealing with Susanna, and the final third, Daniel comes on. That's in verse 44. So we had read the first 4 verses. There once lived in Babylon a man named Joachim, and he married Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, a very beautiful and devout woman. He's going to go on to say how her parents had brought her up religiously and spiritually. He brought her up based on the teachings of the law of Moses. Her parents, religious people, had brought up their daughter according to the law of Moses. Joachim was very rich. His house had a fine garden adjoining it. Now, their gardens there are not like you think of a garden. It's a garden that has trees in it as well, not just a garden of herbs and vegetables. But it's like the Garden of Gethsemane. You're going to have many shady trees in the garden. You have to know that, or you can't determine how someone could hide behind an onion or something, an onion plant or a stalk of corn, and all of this really could take place here. But with trees and shrubbery, that was considered a garden. And you could have a few vegetables on the side, but don't think of the American form of a garden, of a vegetable garden. Joachim was very rich, and his house had a fine garden adjoining it, which was a regular meeting place for the Jews. Well, if the Jews met in our garden, they'd trample all of our produce down. You couldn't let someone meet in your garden, unless it's a garden like they have gardens, and they still have them today, because he was the man of greatest distinction among them. So he's probably pious and religious himself. I would doubt that it's only Susanna, but for some reason a lot of these people who are writing these apocryphal books like to praise the virtues of femininity, and so we have some about Esther and some about all these other women that we've covered thus far. So verses 5 through 14 new material beginning tonight. Verses 5 through 14 present us with the evil design of the two wicked judges. Two wicked judges are important in the story as well. Verses 5 through 14. We have probably all read the story at home, but it's interesting enough to take up our time simply in reading it. Now, two elders of the community were appointed that year as judges. And it was of them that the Lord had said, wickedness came forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges and were supposed to govern my people. These men were constantly at Joachim's house, and everyone who had a cause or a case to be tried came to them there. So the court is held in the garden. These two men are appointed judges, not Joachim. He's simply the owner of the property. And the people have certain civil trials and cases to be judged. Well, this is all according to the law of Moses. Judges were appointed to hear the cases of the people. And so of all places, they're hearing the cases of the people here in the garden of Joachim. When the people went away at noon, everyone always retired around this part of the day and had lunch and refreshed themselves. This was the hottest part of the day and still is in that part of the world. And then you would come back together later on after the heat of the day had passed. Susanna used to go and walk in her husband's garden. Every day the two elders saw her entering the garden and taking her walk, and they were obsessed with lust for her. They no longer prayed to God, but let their thoughts stray from him and forgot the claims of morality. They were both infatuated with her, but they did not tell each other what pangs they suffered because they were ashamed to confess that they wanted to seduce her. Day after day they watched eagerly to see her. One day they said, let us go home. It is time for lunch, these two judges. So they went off in different directions, but soon retraced their steps. Now you can see all this in your mind right from Hollywood. And found themselves face to face, an embarrassing situation. When they questioned one another, each confessed his passion, then they agreed on a time when they might find her alone. So two are better than one. They both have found out each other, that they're not alone in their lust and desires for seduction of Susanna. They left one day, retraced their steps, hoping all would be gone, and the other one had retraced their steps as well. Now, in verse 5, this little paragraph of 5 and 6, in verse 5, it seems like that the author of the history of Susanna has some reference to, well, he says the word of the Lord. However, when you check this out in the Old Testament, you don't find a reference that reads as such. Wickedness came forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges and who were supposed to govern my people. You can tell these are two judges, and of all people, judges should be the highest in their morality. We just read in verse 9 that they forgot the claims of morality. They've been placed over others. They have to be upright themselves. But so many times what happens, you end up with corrupt leaders, corrupt politicians, as we say. If you look over in Jeremiah 29, sometimes you'll see a reference made back to the 29th chapter of Jeremiah, verses 20 through 23, as perhaps being the basis for the reference. Now, since Jeremiah's book would have been written before Daniel's time, Daniel's book, or before, as we know, the history of Susanna, which was not written during the prophet Daniel's time, then they easily could have reference to the prophet Jeremiah. Because remember that in Daniel chapter 9, our book of Daniel chapter 9, he has reference to Jeremiah 25, where he had looked in the scrolls or looked in the books and saw that the time of the captivity of Judah and the destruction of Jerusalem over in Babylon had been fulfilled. He said, then I began to set my face and seek the God of heaven and began to pray for restitution, for restoration, for reconciliation, which is what he gets. And he saw that from Jeremiah's book. Well, Jeremiah and Daniel, if you know your chronology, are living around the same time. Jeremiah a little bit earlier than Daniel. And so what I'm saying is, even assuming that the history of Susanna is we don't assume that, but for sake of argument, and that it does make up Daniel chapter 13, then it could have a valid reference to the book of Jeremiah. Assuming as we do that it does not come during the period of Daniel, then obviously it could have a reference to the book of Jeremiah. Why pick this book while we're turning to Jeremiah? Well, it has to be some book that comes before this time, which means there we have all of the Old Testament before us. It couldn't be some other contemporary writing. Why do they say there in verse 5, it was of them that the Lord had said? Well, through whom did the Lord speak? Through his anointed ministers. They were called prophets in the Old Testament. So it's some prophet that they have reference to. So with that quote, wickedness came forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges and who were supposed to govern my people. With that in mind, well, we'll take a poll with you. Does Jeremiah 29:20 through 23 resemble that? Hear ye therefore the word of the Lord, all ye of the captivity, whom I have sent from Jerusalem to Babylon. Now, if you go back to verse 1, you see we're talking about a letter here. Jeremiah is writing a letter to the captives. Thus saith the Lord of hosts, the God of Israel, of Ahab the son of Koliah, and of Zedekiah the son of Maaseiah, which prophesy a lie unto you in my name, behold, I will deliver them unto the hand of Nebuchadnezzar, king of Babylon, and he shall slay them before your eyes. Now he has reference to two important people. This is not Ahab that you know as the wicked king. This is not a Zedekiah that we know of. But they're two prominent, important people that are set in some type of position, perhaps set themselves, we don't know, in some type of position in Babylon over the captives. Two important people that he specifies by name, Ahab and Zedekiah. He said, these people are prophesying a lie unto you in my name. What are they prophesying? Well, he doesn't tell us a lot about that. But he does predict their fate. Nebuchadnezzar will slay them before your eyes. So this has to be talking about sometime in the beginning of the 70-year period, because Nebuchadnezzar certainly doesn't live through the entire period of captivity. Remember, we date it 606, though, and not 586. But remember, Daniel goes over earlier than 586 anyway, so that doesn't matter. And of them shall be taken up a curse by all the captivity of Judah. He goes on to say that anytime someone else wants to be cursed, then the names of Zedekiah and Ahab will be pronounced over them. Say, may the Lord do to you as he did to them. Because they have committed villainy in Israel, have committed adultery with their neighbors' wives, and have spoken lying words in my name, which I have not commanded them, even I know, and I am a witness, saith the Lord. Say, well, if you're like me, that doesn't look too much like what we have in the history of Susanna, verse 5. He's got some reference to something. Wickedness came forth from Babylon. One thing that we could assume is that the reference in Susanna, history of Susanna, verse 5, is a general reference. Wickedness came forth from Babylon. Well, verse 23 of Jeremiah 29 describes wickedness, villainy, adultery, and false prophecies. And from whom did it come? Daniel and Susanna, verse 5, from judges who were supposed to govern my people. Well, who are these two people, Ahab and Zedekiah, but perhaps judges placed over the people? So there's no way we can positively connect that. However, just for your added information, in the Septuagint version of Jeremiah, there's a very, very close resemblance between Jeremiah 23:15 and Susanna verse 5. Jeremiah 23:15 and Susanna verse 5. So turn over in your text of Jeremiah 23:15, which is not a LXX text. And in our version, it's going to look more unlike Susanna verse 5 than 29:20 through 23. But what's Jeremiah 23 about, though? False leaders, false prophets. Therefore, thus saith the Lord of hosts concerning the prophets. You see, technically, these two men were judges that we have in the history of Susanna. But we're just giving you one text. The Septuagint has a different text. Behold, I will feed them with wormwood, and make them drink the water of gall. For from the prophets of Jerusalem is profaneness gone forth unto all the land. You see, our version of that verse doesn't say too much, because he's not talking about false prophets in Babylonian captivity. He's talking about those in Jerusalem. These are false prophets he has reference to, who are incorrectly leading the people of God, not over in Babylon, but back in Judah, in Jerusalem. So that would all depend on which text is correct. If you want to take LXX as correct, you have to rearrange and then rewrite Jeremiah 23:15, and then Susanna verse 5 ties into that. If you don't, then you have to stay with Jeremiah 29:20 through 23. So if you take the Septuagint text, really either one could be comparable to what we have in the 5th verse of the history of Susanna. So we've got a reference to some prophecy, some book, which one we don't know. But the import of what he's saying is easy to pick up. Wickedness came forth from Babylon, from elders who were judges, and they were supposed to govern my people. So here's their design, verses 5 through 14. Then they agreed on a time when they might find her alone. So we know what they're leading up to, the end of verse 14. Then verses 15 through 27, the execution of their design. Verses 15 through 27. While they were watching for an opportune day, she went into the garden as usual with only 2 maids. It was very hot, and she wished to bathe there. No one else was in the garden except the 2 elders who had hidden and were spying on her. Well, in our garden, you'd have to be lying down behind that row of peas or something to hide. So we know they're talking about a different type of garden. And she said to her maids, "Bring me soap and olive oil and shut the garden door so that I can bathe." Then they did as she told them. They closed the garden doors, went out by the side door to fetch the things they had been ordered to bring. They did not see the elders because they were hiding. As soon as the maids had gone, the 2 elders started up and ran to Susanna. "Look," they said, "the garden doors are shut and no one can see us. We are burning with desire for you, so consent and yield to us. If you refuse, we shall give evidence against you that there was a young man with you, and that was why you sent your maids away." Susanna groaned, said, "I'm in a strait betwixt 2. She said, "I see no way out. If I do this thing, the penalty is death. If I do not, you will have me at your mercy, which will mean death as well. My choice is made. I will not do it. It is better to be at your mercy than to sin against the Lord." Very good biblical precept. Too bad it's not in the Bible as that, but of course we find teaching like that in many places. You could call this situation ethics here. Either way you go, you lose, according to what you can see from this side of the context. Either way you go, you lose. Because if she chooses adultery, she's going to lose there. She sinned against God, and her parents have brought her up with more chastity than that. And if she cries out for deliverance, well, we've got 2 men who are 2 judges who people will probably believe. You can kind of assume this without even having read the conclusion to the story above her testimony on her own behalf. But you can't commit adultery. And so the situationist would say, but if you cry out, they're going to witness against you and you're still going to die. So there is a way out. Commit one evil to save yourself from a worse evil. They didn't have situation ethics then. So verse 24, with that Susanna gave a loud shout. The 2 elders shouted her down. It means they had more volume than she had. One of them ran and opened the garden door. The household, hearing the uproar in the garden, rushed in through the side door to see what had happened to her. When the elders had told their story, the servants were deeply shocked, for no such allegation had ever been made against Susanna. So, let's see, there is a comment I want to make. I don't know how carefully you've read the account, how carefully you've read the story. Maybe we'll come back to that in conclusion to point out something interesting about that. Then verses 28 through 43, all of that is in verses 15 through 27 can be explained just by reading over it. Verses 28 through 43, the judges do just what she fears. They bring her before the people and have a trial. It's their word, two witnesses, who are judges at the same time, against her word, and we're going to find she's going to be convicted before the local people of adultery. Next day, when the people gathered at her husband Joachim's house, the two elders came full of their criminal design to put Susanna to death. So they come back the next day, after all of this has transpired the day before, and it's time for cases again, and people are brought before them. They're discussing various things, making their decisions in the cases that the people bring before them, and then they call a case themselves, and it's the case of them against Susanna, or really Susanna and the crime she has committed with this alleged but non-existent young man. In the presence of the people, they said, "Send for Susanna, daughter of Hilkiah, Joachim's wife." So they sent for her, and she came with her parents and her children and all of her relatives. Now Susanna was a woman of great beauty and delicate feeling. Aren't they all in the fairy tales and stories? And she was closely veiled, but those scoundrels ordered her to be unveiled so that they might feast their eyes upon her beauty. And her family and all who saw her were in tears. And the two elders stood up before the people, Leviticus 24:14, and put their hands on her head. She looked up to heaven through her tears, for she trusted in the Lord. The elders said, "As we were walking alone in the garden, this woman came in with two maids. She shut the garden doors and dismissed her maids. Then a young man who had been in hiding came and lay down with her." You see, they're saying that she and this young man had all of this planned all along. She's trying to get rid of these maids so she and the young man can lie together. "We were in a corner of the garden, and when we saw this wickedness, we ran up to them. And though we saw them in the act, we could not hold the man, for he was too strong for us." That's possible, but not totally believable without some more investigation, because you've got two against one. And when you catch someone right in the act of adultery, they're not exactly ready just to take off running. I mean, this part of the story gives me a problem right here. And then what did you do? We're never told about Susanna. She have no clothes on or what? These honest, righteous judges, did they cover up their eyes real quickly? He opened the door and forced his way out, and we seized the woman. Well, was she a naked woman or what? And asked who the young man was, but she would not tell us. This is our evidence. As they were elders of the people and judges, the assembly believed them and condemned her to death. Then Susanna cried out loudly, "Eternal God," here's her little short prayer, "Eternal God, who dost know all secrets and foresee all things, thou knowest that their evidence against me was false. Now I am to die guiltless, though I am, of all the wicked things these men have said against me." Now back up as I quoted in verse 34, according to Leviticus 24 and verse 14, which we might as well take a look at, because the story is following, biblical precepts. It's not something that's just totally off the wall. It has to be written by a Jew, no doubt about that. We don't know a lot about the authorship of all of these books. It seems like they're written by Jews. There's no doubt about the fact this was written by a Jew. Leviticus 24 and verse 14, because who else but a faithful Jew who had read the Torah would know about this practice in Susanna verse 34. We have someone here in Leviticus 24 who has blasphemed God, used his name in vain. The Lord spake unto Moses, saying, "Bring forth him that hath cursed without the camp, and let all that heard him, only for the witnesses. Let the witnesses lay their hands upon his head, and let all the congregation stone him." Let the witnesses lay their hands upon his head. Just part of the Levitical practice, Leviticus 24:14. Susanna 34, then the two elders stood up before the people and put their hands on her head. So someone's read the Old Testament. And I wouldn't say they have to really be scheming and planning to work this in. That would just come out naturally. If you're a Jew who's read the Old Testament, you're writing a story like this, and an event like this comes up, this would just naturally be what you would say. So we have a little prayer added in verses 42 and 43 for God to recognize that all of the witness they have given is false compared to what she has given. Then we have verses 44 through 64, the conclusion to the story, the vindication of virtue over vice and good over evil and truth over lies and chastity over carnal thinking, Susanna's deliverance at the wisdom of young Daniel. This is why we said in some Greek manuscripts it is prefixed to the book of Daniel, because he's called a devout young man. To be chapter 13, he might be devout, but not a young man, rather an old one. The Lord heard her cry just as she was being led off to execution. Well, we call this a cliffhanger today. It's a cliffhanger. Just as she was being led off to execution, God inspired a devout young man named Daniel to protest. And he shouted out, "I will not have this woman's blood on my head." All the people turned and asked him, "What do you mean by that?" He came forward and said, "Are you such fools, you Israelites, as to condemn a woman of Israel without making careful inquiry and finding out the truth? Reopen the trial. The evidence these men have brought against her is false." So the people all hurried back, and the rest of the elders said to him, "Come, take your place among us and state your case, for God has given you the standing of an elder." And Daniel said to them, "Separate these men and keep them at a distance from each other, and I will examine them." One of the earliest known references, the earliest one that I can think of, one of the earliest known references to the process of cross-examination. And if you're going to cross-examine like that and you have more than one party involved, you don't want to lock them up in the same cell. They'll get their stories together. Now, would you think, if you hadn't watched TV, to write a book like this? This fella is very bright who wrote this book. He didn't have TVs back then. Where do you get the idea of cross-examination? Well, separate the two. Don't keep them together. They're going to get their stories together. And if their stories coincide, well, that's too bad. And that's too much in their favor, and it's against Susanna. When they'd been separated, Daniel summoned one of them. And it's been suggested, as I think I told you last week, it's been suggested that the present day process of cross-examination, to some extent, is based on the book of Susanna. I mean, if you are an airplane pilot or something and you read something that just really revolutionized what you were doing for a living, even if it was way back in the history of Susanna, well, that's going to spread like wildfire. Someone read this account. I'm just saying, assuming this is true, someone read this account and thought, what a good way to deal with people whenever we're talking about a trial. Instead of just taking the word of these two witnesses, because what if they aren't reliable? And you can't ask for more. We don't have any more. The only other one who could be a witness is the young man, and he's gone. And Susanna has contradicted them, so it's the old majority, 2 against 1. But many times the majority is wrong, though. So cross-examination. Daniel summons one of them. "You hardened sinner." Sounds like Jesus and the Pharisees there. "You hardened sinner," he said. "The sins of your past have come home to you. You gave unjust decisions, condemning the innocent and acquitting the guilty, although the Lord has said, 'You shall not put to death an innocent and guiltless man.'" Well, back to an Old Testament reference, Exodus 23 and verse 7. You see, the book is filled with quotations from the Old Testament. Exodus 23 and verse 7. Because he said, "Although the Lord has said." Well, through whom did he say? His ministers. They were known as prophets in the Old Testament. Here, the prophet Moses. Exodus 23 and verse 7. Keep thee far from a false matter. Well, that's what we have exactly here is a false matter. The innocent and righteous slay thou not. You see, they've got it reversed. They're killing the innocent and letting the guilty go free. For I will not justify the wicked. So probably a quotation from Exodus 23 or a similar passage. It's just that Exodus 23 reads very similar. The intent of it is very similar to what you have here. You shall not put to death an innocent or a guiltless man. Now, beginning with verse 54, we get into the questions of the process of cross-examination. Now then, if you saw this woman, tell us, this is before all the people, under what tree did you see them together? Well, that proves the point without even thinking ahead that I said earlier they had gardens that were filled with fruit trees, among other trees, as we'll see with these strange names of the trees here. What tree? Would you have thought to ask a question like that? Because then you're going to ask the other one. You know what he's going to do. You're going to ask the other one the same question, which must have meant there's, well, we've got a plurality, at least two trees, and maybe more than that. Probably we do. So Daniel had a good chance to get them to lie. And you know, whenever you know you're lying and then someone asks you what tree, well, you think real quickly, whatever tree comes to your mind first of the trees in the garden. And they're out of luck because they don't think of the same tree when they think quickly. And he answered, under a clove tree. Then Daniel retorted, very good, this lie has cost you your life. For already God's angel has received your sentence from God, and he will cleave you in two. He told him to stand aside and ordered them to bring in the other. They've been separated so they can't get their stories together. Now, at the bottom of the page in the footnotes, you're told all that you need to be told here. That we have a pun. We have a pun in the Greek. I didn't bring the Greek words. I didn't want to burden you with that. But they've tried to translate it into English. You know what a pun is, a play on words. And that's why we have clove and cleave. The Greek words aren't clove and cleave. There's no such thing as this clove tree here. It says in the footnote, literally, a mastic tree. There is such thing as a mastic tree. But you see, they both start with a CL, clove and cleave. So you have a pun. And the pun is there in the Greek. It's a very strong pun. Then we're going to have a twofold pun, a pun for the first witness and a pun for the second judge as well. So here's what the pun is. He says in verse 54, under a clove tree. Daniel says in verse 55, because you've lied, God will clove you, or to put it in the right grammar, God will cleave you in two. So it's the clove and cleave, the pun, the play on words. One down and one to go. He said to him, spawn of Canaan. This is a second judge here. What biting language he's using. You spawn of Canaan, no son of Judah. Beauty has been your undoing. Susanna's and lust has corrupted your heart. Now we know how you've been treating the women of Israel. Well, Daniel's got all this by that inspiration we read in verse 45, evidently, because this isn't the first or the only time. Frightening them into consorting with you. But here is a woman of Judah who would not submit to your villainy. Now then, tell me, what tree was it under when you surprised her and the young man? He said, under a yew tree. Well, there's no such thing as a yew tree either. He replied, and Daniel said to him, very good, this lie has cost you your life. I think here we've got one tree, prenos, and one prisai. So, again, it's a pun. That's the Greek, but it's a pun, a play on words. Very good. This lie has cost you your life. The angel of God is waiting with his sword to hew you down and destroy you both. So here's that pun. He said under a yew tree. Daniel said, good, because of that yew tree, God will hew you down. And again, you find, if you've got a version like mine, down in the footnotes, you see the pun stated. So they both lied. They've been caught in cross-examination. And the whole assembly gave a great shout and praised God, the Savior of those who trust in him. They turned on the two elders, for out of their own mouth Daniel had convicted them of giving false evidence. They dealt with them according to the law of Moses, which was what? To put them to death. Deuteronomy 19 verses 18 and 19. Another reference, filled with references back to the Mosaic Law. Deuteronomy 19, verses 18 and 19. They dealt with them according to the law of Moses, which was what? They were put to death, which was where? Deuteronomy 19, 18 and 19. The judges shall make diligent inquisition, and behold, if the witness be a false witness, and hath testified falsely against his brother, then shall ye do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. Well, what do they want to happen to Susanna? Her to be put to death. So shalt thou put the evil away from among you. So that's strictly according to Mosaic law. Whatever was their intent, and these happen to be judges, but they're witnesses as well. The roles have been reversed. Daniel becomes the judge. Daniel becomes the judge, and the two judges become the witness. They testified falsely about their neighbor, Susanna. And what have they desired? Her to be put to death, so the same is done to them, as they in their wickedness had tried to do to their neighbor. And so an innocent life, was saved that day. Then Hilkiah and his wife gave praise for their daughter Susanna, because she was found innocent of a shameful deed, and so did her husband Joachim and all her relatives, and from that day forward Daniel was great among the people. Now the names in the book, Susanna means lily. Susanna means lily. What do you think of when you think of lily? Pure and white. Innocence. Daniel's name means what? God is my judge. El is my judge. God is my judge. Well, it fits very well. He is the judge. Daniel is the judge in the book, and Susanna is the white water lily that's pure and innocent and who has done no wrong. So the story fits and the names fit and so forth. Date for the book, sometime after Daniel's time and sometime before Jesus' time. Nobody knows. As you can tell, because it's a story that's not filled with true historical facts or allusions, well, there's nothing by which we can date the book. But you know, as with the others, probably the first 2 centuries B.C. Probably sometime, perhaps the 1st century B.C. This is when we're finding a lot of these books being produced. And then finally, with this book, the purpose of the book. Well, right away on the surface, you can see that it's an exaltation of purity, of innocence. It's an exaltation of faith. Time and time again, she's trusting in God. As we read, for instance, in verse 35, she looked up to heaven through her tears, for she trusted in the Lord. An exaltation of the efficacy, the effectiveness of prayers offered in faith to God, verse 43. So, in short, it's on the surface a story that praises virtue in face of vice. But there may be a deeper purpose. There may be a deeper underlying purpose. There's a chance that the author might mean for us to gather something else. Perhaps it is a satire of the current wicked administration. Now, you have to strike out from your mind right now anything about Daniel, Nebuchadnezzar, Babylon, and the captivity. The book doesn't even have to do with that. Because if it's not written during Daniel's time, it's not written during Babylonian captivity time, he just adopts that and weaves this fanciful tale to tell a story, but maybe the implication is for someone to read this and get thinking, that's right, look at these wicked judges. And let's just say, for instance, we're living 50 B.C. now. We're living 50 B.C. And they read the book, whoever's reading it, it's being written, whoever's reading it, they don't think that it's, has anything to do with Daniel. It's just a story. wasn't written back in the 5th century BC or the 6th century BC. And so they get thinking, that's right, look at these two wicked judges, these old men, and look at this young man, verse 44, this young, devout man named Daniel that God inspires and gives him more wisdom. And they get thinking, yeah, and what are our rulers like today? These old codgers who are leading us today, they're just as wicked as the people here in the story, and what we need are new young men for God to raise up as the administrators of the people of God, assuming they're in Israel now, which there's no reason not to assume that, to be administrators of the law of God and of the people of God and of justice and uprightness here in the land. And that's a good guess. I favor that highly, that it seems to be more than just a story told as a bedtime tale. That the author is quite intelligent, and probably the underlying theme and current is that it's a satire of the current wicked administration of older men, and a prediction that God is going to raise up young men to take their place. Judicial reformers, in other words. The satire in the hopeful expectation of God raising up young judicial reformers. Can you see what I'm saying?
Amen.
Okay. It praises virtue, and it praises innocence, and it praises chastity, and it praises the law of Moses, and all of this as well. But there seems to be something deeper underlying it. Why does it relate to judges and old judges versus this judge Daniel, who's a young man? Perhaps because of the satirical theme of the book. Okay, any questions on that? We're going to try to finish the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon.
Isn't there some place where if a woman went against her husband in adultery that she was to drink some poison or do something in the Old Testament?
Yes, in the book of Numbers there was something that was known as the trial of jealousy. But that was only if her husband suspected her of committing the crime of adultery. We never have any reference in the Old Testament of that ever being carried out or ever being practiced one single time. So it's something that's antiquated, something we don't know a lot about. But that was only if her husband suspected her. And there was an elaborate ceremony that she had to go through. And there seems to be maybe some reference. She had to drink a certain portion of water, and the King James Version said that if she has lied to her husband, she has committed adultery, then the priest was to pronounce upon her a curse, may this water rot your thigh. It's been suggested by some, perhaps it's really a curse of miscarriage or spontaneous abortion instead of the literal rotting of the thigh. But we don't need to get into that. That's Old Testament theology and what the Jews did under the older covenant. Okay, moving along, let's do the third and final of the additions to Daniel. And then we'll be ready for some of those wisdom books then. I've always known it, I see it's referred to here, Daniel, Bel, and the snake. I've always known it myself as the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. So I don't guess it makes a big difference, but it is a history. Bel and the dragon are destroyed, so I guess it's a good name. That's just what I've always known it back from my early conversion days, is the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. So you remember it as you wish, Bel and the dragon, Bel and the snake, or whatever. He's called in verse 23 a huge snake, probably more on the order of a dragon. Or maybe a big lizard, so we're getting in between a dragon and a snake. I don't know. So anyway, this story, the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon, matches, if not surpasses, the intricacy of the details of the story that we've just read, the history of Susanna. In some regards, I think it, in one regard, I think it definitely surpasses the intricacy of even that cross-examination bit that we went through in the history of Susanna. And what that is, I will show to you when we get there. It's one of the world's greatest, and as we've said before, earliest short stories. Let's tackle it. Like History of Susanna, the book is clearly divided in its outline into 3 sections. And by the way, remember it makes up Daniel 14 in the Catholic Bible. Daniel 14. Now, if you've got a Jerusalem Bible or some Catholic version, an American Bible or something, then you can look it up and see chapters 13 and 14. So the book's divided into 3 sections, verses 1 through 22. Verses 1 through 22, we have the story of Bel, B-E-L, the story of Bel, B-E-L. So the book's divided into 3 sections, verses 1 through 22. Verses 1 through 22, we have the story of Bel, B-E-L, the story of Bel, B-E-L. You can tell there are at least 2 major subjects in the book, Bel and the dragon. So the first part deals with the account of Bel, B-E-L. This was the great patron deity of the city of Babylon, more technically known as Marduk, M-A-R-D-U-K, which had been the chief Babylonian god of its pantheon since Abraham's time. Remember, Abraham came from the land of the Babylonians or the Chaldeans. And there's no doubt about the fact that Bel or Marduk was the patron deity of the pantheon in Babylon at the time of the patriarch Abraham, somewhere on the order of 2250 BC.
College mascots are confident, but when it comes to mortgages,
technically he's known as Marduk. 3 times the name appears in our Old Testament. You probably remember coming across these. They're in Isaiah and Jeremiah. In both of the books, he's referred to, this patron deity, he's referred to as Bel, B-E-L, not Marduk, Bel. Isaiah 46 and verse 1. The great, great temple of Bel that was adorned by Nebuchadnezzar was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. If you didn't know about Bel, who he is, well, then you don't know what's going on here in Isaiah 46:1. Now, Nebo, it's another reference to the Babylonian pantheon. Bel boweth down, Nebo stoopeth. Their idols were upon the beasts, upon the cattle. Your carriages were heavy loaden. They were a burden to the weary beast. They stooped, they bow down together. They could not deliver the burden, but themselves are gone into captivity. It's just a prediction of the judgment of Babylon, God's destruction of the Babylonians and their idolatrous form of worship. And so he has to mention their chief god, like the god of the Canaanites was Baal, or Baal as we say it, B-A-A-L. There's a close similarity in all of these pagan religions, as maybe we can study one day in a class in comparative religions. They just went by different names, but there was a chief super male god figure that, of course, the critics say Jehovah, Yahweh. He was just the name of this super male god figure among the Hebrews, and some people had Jupiter, and other people had Zeus, and some people had Baal, and others Marduk, and some Baal, and on down the line. And so Jehovah and Yahweh, he's just another name, just the Hebrew conception of this chief male god figure. There's relationships between all of these gods. That's what I'm saying. Jeremiah 50 in verse 2, not between our God, I don't mean that. I just mean between all these gods, these father figure gods. Jeremiah 50 and verse 2. I've told you before, I brought you a quote one time in some message of what a critical scholar said in reference to this demon of a god that belched fire and brimstone out of the middle of Mount Sinai. He called God a demon, called Yahweh a demon that belched fire and brimstone. He's like Jupiter. When you get him mad, he'll throw a thunderbolt at you. And by the way, we even use that as a figure of speech today. Look where we got that. God will throw a thunderbolt at someone. Where do we get that? Right out of pagan mythology. The pagan religions of the Greeks and of the Romans. I've told you before, so many things. We're studying intertestamental periods. So many things we use as just figures of speech. You don't even know where you got it. Your Ajax cleaner, where do you get that? Ajax. You don't have a boy next door to you named Ajax. It'd be a strange name today, but where'd you get that name? Where do we get this concept God would throw a lightning bolt? We call them thunderbolts because they go with thunder. Technically a lightning bolt, that God would throw a lightning bolt. Well, Zeus and Jupiter, remember they're the same God, just one's a Roman name and one's a Greek name. They threw lightning bolts whenever they got mad at people. I'm not saying you can't use it, I'm just saying recognize the figure of speech that comes from pagan mythology. Because if you can't use that, then you can't call next month August, because that also comes from paganism. And January comes from paganism, and October comes from paganism, and Tuesday comes from paganism. All of that does. You know that our whole life. My. Maybe you didn't know that. It's getting quiet now. What are we going to call these days? Well, better call them what everyone else calls them, and know that we're delivered, and it won't hurt you if you use some pagan god's name to call tomorrow. Verse 1, the word that the Lord spake against Babylon. Here's this beginning of the long prophecy of the judgment and destruction of Babylon. And against the land of the Chaldeans by Jeremiah the prophet. Declare ye among the nations, and publish, and set up a standard, publish, and conceal not. Say, Babylon is taken, and Bel is confounded. So Bel there again is a reference to the false idol, the false god. 1 Corinthians 10, the demon that controlled the Babylonians. Jeremiah 51 and 44. I will punish Bel in Babylon. Now the critics really like verses like this because they're saying that means that God believed in the real existence of Bel. But there's another way to scripturally explain verses like this. I will punish Bel, because Bel was just a stone statue that was covered with gold and bronze that was set up in the temple of Marduk. I will bring forth out of his mouth that which he hath swallowed up. Well, that's going to fit our apocryphal story real well. And say, see there? Even the Hebrews believed that this idol could really eat. The nations shall not flow together any more unto him, yea, the wall of Babylon shall fall. The nations shall not flow together unto him anymore. Because, as I said, it was one of the 7 ancient wonders of the world. Now, that was during the time of Nebuchadnezzar. Bel had been the patron deity for 1,500 years before Nebuchadnezzar comes on the scene. And a temple, of course, had been established. But Nebuchadnezzar is the one that erects a larger temple and adorns it with all of the splendor of gold and silver and precious stones. Okay, so with all of that background, then we'll get into the first 22 verses. Oh, one other comment. Herodotus tells us that whenever Xerxes returned from that defeat that he suffered at the hands of the Greeks when he tried to take mainland Greece, see how it all ties together again? And he came back 480, 479, pouting and mad, and ends up getting Esther as his queen. Well, he was so mad when he came back that as he passed through Babylon, he completely annihilated the worship in the temple of Marduk. That's historical fact, that it was destroyed by Xerxes in 479 BC. But remember, Nebuchadnezzar's on the scene quite a bit earlier. I was just speaking with someone the other day. We were again talking about the subject of all of these various things that we study and the importance of all of this. And I was telling them, you know, one thing that's so important in looking at all this, rather than just have me know all of this, is because I never could teach you anything. Then you'd say, Xerxes, what is a Xerxes? And you would have to pause and go into that for a long time. The more you can know about these things, it makes it a lot easier just to hop, skip, and jump along. Which probably has a pagan reference itself, hop, skip, and jump. Verse 1. You have to watch out for those sodomite shoes, you really do. When King Astyages, do you remember who King Astyages was? I won't charge you if you don't, because we didn't spend time with that. Do you remember King Astyages? He was the Median king that came just before Cyrus, who began the Achaemenid line of Persian kings. Astyages was the king before him. We're around the middle of the 6th century BC. When King Astyages was gathered to his fathers, he was succeeded on the throne by Cyrus the Persian. Now, Astyages was a Mede. That's why it's called the Medo-Persian Empire. First ruled by the Medes and then by the Persians. And Daniel was a confidant of the king, the most honored of all the king's friends. Now, the Babylonians had an idol called Bel, for which they provided, listen to this appetite, every day 12 bushels of fine flour. You think your teenage boys eat a lot? 40 sheep and 50 gallons of wine. Lord, deliver us from a family that large. It'd take the ransom of a king to feed them for a month. The king held it to be divine and went daily to worship it, but Daniel worshipped his God. So the king said to him, "Why don't you worship Bel?" He replied, "Because I do not believe in man-made idols, but in the living God who created heaven and earth and the things that are on the earth from which they made their idol, and is sovereign over all mankind." The king said, "Do you think that Bel is not a living God?" You see, the argument, do you know what? I forgot to tell you what I wanted to tell you about Susanna. Paul's reverse, go back to Susanna. I just remembered that I skipped over the interesting thing that I had noticed in reading the book. That just didn't click in my mind of the story being a valid story. Now, we're studying it as a story being written to entertain and then get across a theme, but it's written as strict history. This really, literally happened. Okay, assuming that, verse 16, no one else was in the garden except the two elders who had hidden and were spying on her. She said to her maids, "Bring me soap and olive oil and shut the garden doors so that I can bathe." They've gone into the garden, she and her two maids. She needs this soap and olive oil with which to bathe. She tells them, "Go and fetch this and bring this back to me. I'll be waiting for you. Once you bring it back, I'll bathe." They did as she told them. They closed the garden doors and went out by the side door to fetch the things they had been ordered to bring. They did not see the elders because they were hiding. As soon as the maids had gone, the two elders started up and ran to Susanna. "Look," they said, "the garden doors are shut and no one can see us. We are burning with desire for you, so consent and yield to us. If you refuse, we shall give evidence against you that there was a young man with you, and that was why you sent your maids away." Now, here's the illogical nature of these verses that we're reading here. These men, if they're telling the story, they must have known, verse 17, that she sent her maids to go and then come back and then evidently leave again so she can bathe in private. You wouldn't dare come out. They're going to be back in just a couple of moments. And they don't know that she's not going to consent. They're assuming that she is. So that means you're going to, and I guess you're both going to commit adultery with her. And you're going to do that in the short space of time before those maids get back with soap and olive oil. No, the thing to do is wait till they bring it back, then go again. And then you're waiting until she gets into the water, wherever that is, to bathe herself. So that doesn't make any sense to me. Brilliant story, but he missed one thing, though. We've said that before. They always miss something that's very obvious and very evident when you just take the time to read it. I think that's a major mistake. Oh, I see the brilliance of the writer in other regards, but I see his ignorance there. So back to the history of the destruction of Bel and the dragon. What I was going to say here in verse 6 is that in the first case, the case of Bel, the question is over whether or not Bel is alive. Because the king is going to use that against Daniel when we come to the dragon. Notice the first question the king asks in verse 6, "Do you think that Bel is not a living God?" Notice he didn't say God. Do you think he is not a living God? "Do you not see how much he eats and drinks each day?" 12 bushels of fine flour, the 40 sheep, and 50 gallons of wine. Daniel laughed and said, "Don't be deceived, your majesty. This bell of yours is clay inside and bronze outside, and he's never eaten anything at all." Then the king was angry and summoned the priests of Bel and said to them, "If you cannot tell me who it is that eats up all these provisions, you shall die. But if you can show that it is Bel that eats them, then Daniel shall die for his blasphemy against Bel." Daniel said to the king, "Let it be as you command." Parentheses, there were 70 priests of Bel, not counting their wives and children. Into parentheses because that's going to be important later on in the story. Then the king went with Daniel into the temple of Bel. The priests said, "We are now going outside. Set out the food yourself, your majesty," Cyrus, king of the Persians, "and mix the wine, then shut the door and seal it with your own signet, like a wax signet, so that once it's broken, you know someone has been in. When you come back in the morning, if you do not find that Bel has eaten it all, let us be put to death. But if Daniel's charges against us turn out to be false, then he shall die." They treated the whole affair with contempt because they had made a hidden entrance under the table, and they regularly went in by it and ate everything up. My problem with that is too much like Hollywood. If you know anything about when you used to watch the old junk box, there's nothing any good on it anymore because you already know who the good guy and the bad guy is at the very beginning of the story, which is no good. There used to be some old shows where you had to work and figure things out. And today you can already tell who's good and who's bad. You're just waiting to find out how the good guy's going to get saved. The story would be a lot better if you would not have put in this 13th verse here. Don't tell us about this hidden entrance. And we're still trying to figure out, well, Daniel's really up a creek without a paddle because Bel, we know that he's eating this food, or why would these priests be so boastful in saying, well, put us and Bel to the test? So I don't like that. I wish he would have put it at the end of the story. So when the priests had gone, the king set out the food for Bel, and Daniel ordered his servants to bring ashes and sift them over the whole temple in the presence of the king alone. This has to be the best thing of all of the additions to Daniel. This one thing right here. Like I said, if you ever watched Peter Falk and Columbo back in those days, or Macmillan and Wife, then you know what this is all about. Macmillan's not doing too good today, it doesn't seem like. Then they left the temple, closed the door, sealed it with the king's signet, and went away. During the night, the priests, it's dark at night, there are no street lights, with their wives and children came as usual and ate and drank everything. 70 priests, not counting their wives and children, that's why I had to give that to us in the parenthetical edition, drank the 50 gallons of wine, ate the however many cakes, these 12 bushels of fine flour. You don't just eat flour, you'll die of eating flour. The cakes that you make from the flour, and 40 sheep. They had a big appetite, or big families, one or the other, or both together. Early in the morning, the king came, and Daniel with him. The king said, "Are the seals intact, Daniel?" He said, "They are intact, your majesty." He's not afraid at all. And as soon as he opened the door, the king looked at the table and cried, "Great art thou, O Bel." You can see the ignorance of pagan man here. He just believes whatever he sees, you know. In thee there is no deceit at all. Well, not in him, but in his ministers, though. Daniel laughed. That's what we're doing tonight. Laughed and held back the king from going in. "Just look at the floor," he said, "and judge whose footprints these are." The king said, "I see the footprints of men, women, and children." That's the addition in verse 10. I think this is the best of all of the stories here. In a rage, it reminds me of a story. I'll tell you a story about myself one time. I was a mischievous boy, as I guess all of you were. But to show you how your things can backfire on you, I had a neighbor who a young boy, younger than myself, who I just didn't like at all. And I decided I would get him one day. And We always, as little boys, we had lots of flowers and flowering plants and bushes in our yard, and we would always capture bees in, old mayonnaise jars with holes punched in the top, or if we didn't want them to live, with no holes punched and some cotton with a little chloroform that our parents would bring home from work down in the bottom and kill the bees. So I collected a whole jar with no lid, with no holes in the lid, and some chloroform in the bottom, killed all those bees. And I guess I didn't get it from Daniel and Bell and the Dragon because I'd never read the book before. But I sprinkled it right at the bottom of his steps so that when he came out his house, he would step on these bees. But you see, I didn't completely kill them. I just kind of wounded them enough so they couldn't fly. And he came out and stepped over the bees. And we went back in his house a few moments later, and I stepped on the bees. It stung my feet something terrible. I ran home crying. I learned not to do that again. The best laid plans of mice and men can backfire on you. That's one of those literal stories. This isn't a story I'm making up to entertain. It really did happen. So that came to my mind when I see the footprints of men, women, and children. Now, rage, he put the priests under arrest with their wives and children, and they showed him the secret doors through which they used to go in and consume what was on the table. So the king put them to death and handed Bel over to Daniel, who destroyed the idol and its temple. Well, no man could have destroyed this huge ancient wonder of the world. It wasn't destroyed until the time of Xerxes, so that's chronological, historical inaccuracy right away, verse 22. He maybe could have destroyed the idol, but not the temple, though. My, someone's ending up being dumb again. We praise these people, and they end up disappointing us later on. Then the second section, verses 23 through 32. The next object of worship among the ancient Babylonians, of which we have no historical reference material like we do even in our Old Testament, as we saw in a threefold case with Bel. The next object of worship is this living snake or dragon. You see, Bel obviously was just an idol. He was dead. He didn't exist. He was just a piece of wood or stone. But this snake is alive, or this dragon is alive. Remember we said in verse 6, the first thing Cyrus asks Daniel is, do you not think that Bel is a living God? He said, of course I don't think that he's living. So verse 23, now then there was a huge dragon which the Babylonians held to be divine. The king said to Daniel, now you can't say about this dragon, like you said about Bel, that he's not a living God, because there he is right there. He's alive. So worship him. Daniel answered, I will worship the Lord my God, for he is the living God. So he must have meant more when he said God is the living God than Cyrus meant when he said this dragon is a living dragon, because he indeed was alive. But give me authority, your majesty, and without sword or staff I will kill the dragon. I give it you, said the king. So Daniel took pitch and fat and hair, like something a cat spits up when it chews on too much grass, you know. I hope you've already had dinner before you came. Boiled them together and made them into cakes, which he put into the mouth of the snake. And it was a time bomb, nitroglycerin. When the snake ate it, it burst asunder. Well, that's really fanciful there. I lose interest in the story after Daniel has scattered the ashes and the footprints are marked in them. Now, we're not told, we could wish for more information, what else went into this combination of pitch, fat, and hair, although that's almost enough to make you explode if you ate all that. You know, is it really some magical formula, or was it simply the faith of Daniel? This was him acting his faith to feed the serpent anything. You could have fed him anything. And this old serpent or snake or dragon or lizard or whatever would have burst asunder. We're not told that. Some of the details are left out. We with the Western mind want to know all of the details, but the Orientals don't necessarily put all of them in. So he eats the pitch, fat, and hair, and burst asunder. Then Daniel said, "See what things you worship." When the Babylonians heard of this, they gathered in an angry crowd to oppose the king, and they accused him of becoming a Jew. "The king has turned Jew," they cried. "He has pulled down Bel, killed the dragon, and put the priest to the sword." So they went to the king and said, "Hand Daniel over to us, or else we will kill you and your family." The king, finding himself hard-pressed, was compelled to give Daniel up to them. Now we have an interesting contrast between the king when he had no way out and Susanna when she had no way out. Because he's going to give up an innocent man to death simply to save his own hide. But Susanna was not going to commit a crime against God. She was going to do what she had to do and then suffer the consequences. So there is, when you compare the two stories, a remarkable contrast between what the king does when he has no way out and Susanna when she has no way out. And they threw him into the lion pit, and he was there for 6 days. There were 7 lions in the pit, and every day 2 men and 2 sheep were fed to them. But now they were given nothing to make sure that they would devour Daniel. Verses 23 through 32. Well, obviously we have problems with this story. It seems like we have some concocted magical formula with this pitch and fat and hair to actually cause this creature to burst asunder. So that's a problem. But of course the chief problem is Daniel in the lion's den. Do you expect us to believe, as we're reading the whole book of Daniel, to believe in 2 accounts of Daniel in the lion's den? I think that's stretching it enough. The critics have problem believing just our 1 account of Daniel in the lion's den. And now you're trying to get us to believe 2 accounts of Daniel being thrown into the lion's den. That doesn't sound very good. It should have been a tiger's den. It really should have. It's more believable than it happened, in some other way. But Daniel in the lion's den, we already find that in the book of Daniel. Someone's really been meditating on the book of Daniel. They couldn't think of anything besides lions, evidently. And so he's thrown in. Well, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Then finally, the final division, verses 33 through 42. Now they are connected with the second division. The story continues, but it is a new division because the scene shifts from Babylon to Palestine. And then back to Babylon, and then for at least one man back to Palestine. So verses 23 through 42 go together. But there's a break between verses 32 and 33. And in this final division, the prophet Habakkuk is introduced. At least the chronology is finally right. It generally isn't throughout the Apocrypha. But Habakkuk does come during the time of the prophet Daniel. At least he didn't pick Isaiah or something. So at least the chronology fits of Habakkuk and Daniel living at the same time. Now the prophet Habakkuk was in Judea. He made a stew and crumbled bread into the bowl, and he was on the way to his field carrying it to the reapers. Evidently he owned a field of wheat or barley, and they are harvesting it, and he's carrying them out something to eat. When an angel of the Lord said, "Habakkuk, carry the meal you have with you to Babylon for Daniel, who is in the lion pit." Habakkuk said, "My Lord, I've never been to Babylon. I do not know where the lion pit is." Then the angel took the prophet by the crown of his head, and carrying him by his hair, he swept him to Babylon with the blast of his breath and put him down above the pit. Well, that would sound fanciful, except we have a reference to a prophet of ours where something like that happened. Ezekiel 8 and verse 3. Ezekiel 8 and verse 3. It's only that here in the account of Ezekiel, it says that he was taken in the visions of God. And that still doesn't tell us whether it was a bodily transportation or not. It could have been, and still could be considered in the visions of God. But, well, we'll read the verse, verse 3 of Ezekiel 8. He put forth the form of a hand, this is God, and took me, Ezekiel. Well, if it happened to Ezekiel, it could happen to Habakkuk. By a lock of mine head, and the Spirit lifted me up between the earth and the heaven, and brought me in the visions of God to Jerusalem, to the door of the inner gate that looketh toward the north, where was the seat of the image of jealousy, which provoketh to jealousy. And behold, the glory of the God of Israel was there, according to the vision that I saw in the plain. So it could have just been, in vision form, in the Spirit, we say. In the Spirit he was taken. But remember, Paul had an account in his life over in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. He said he was caught up somewhere. He said, whether in the body I cannot tell, or whether out of the body I cannot tell, only God knows. So we could say that about Ezekiel in some of his cases where it seems like he's transported, whether in the body, whether out of the body, we cannot tell, but God knows. Paul couldn't even tell himself. Say, well, maybe Ezekiel knew. Well, maybe he did, but Paul didn't know. When he was called up into the third heaven, he said that whether in the body or out of the body, I don't know. But I know that I was called up to the third heaven, to paradise, and I heard things unspeakable, things unlawful for a man to utter. So we have biblical basis for verse 36. The angel took the prophet by the crown of his head, and carrying him by his hair, he swept him to Babylon with the blast of his breath, and put him down above the pit. I won't bog down in the English here. Put down above the pit, that means you're suspended in midair. Habakkuk called out, Daniel, Daniel, take the meal that God has sent you. Daniel said, O God, he's praying now to God, not speaking to Habakkuk, thou dost indeed remember me. Thou dost never forsake those who love thee. Then he got up and ate, and God's angel returned Habakkuk at once to his home. On the seventh day, the king went to mourn for Daniel, because he thought he would be dead at this time. But when he arrived at the pit and looked in, there sat Daniel. The king cried, Great art thou, O Lord, the God of Daniel. Well, that happened right in our book of Daniel. And there is no God but thou alone. So the king drew Daniel up, and the men who had planned to destroy him he flung into the pit, and then and there they were eaten up before his eyes. Date for the book, no idea, maybe around the same time as Susanna, 100 BC or something. The purpose of the book, again, I think it's an underlying purpose. You can see Daniel's piety, his faith, his prayers, and so forth. But an underlying purpose is that perhaps the book is written as a biting critique against idolatry and against all of the priesthoods of the heathen. Whether some Jews are caught up in idolatry, and the Jew who's writing this book is so repulsed by that he pens this, or whether just in the monotheistic, nationalistic pride of the native natural Jew, because he serves one God, because he sees that all the nations around him are not monotheists but polytheists, then he writes this as a critique against the worthlessness, foolishness, the decadence of idolatry, the stupidity of the priesthoods of the heathen. So he was a religious man, a very religious man. Because if you're criticizing the priesthood of some other nation, then you're exalting the priesthood of the nation of Israel. It may have been a priest, because it's all about the priesthood and idols and the liturgical worship of your idol or of your true and living God. So it could have been a priest writing the book. But beyond that, we know nothing.